James Baldwin as a conceptual engineer. So what do I mean by conceptual engineer? Conceptual engineering is a kind of fancy term for a really old thing that philosophy has been doing for a long time. So the conceptual engineer is an engineer because they build new concepts and they make the concepts that we have better, is the idea. And that's one of philosophy's key activities, is generating new concepts and improving the concepts that we have. And I think that this is a really important and interesting way to think about what Baldwin is doing in his very short essay on being white and other lies, which was published in a popular magazine, the magazine Essence, in 1984. And Baldwin's innovation in this essay is, as Coates actually captures it, is to suggest a kind of inversion of the traditional way of looking at the concept of race. He says race is the child of racism, not the father. This is really radical. So the sort of traditional or standard approach, one that arguably emerges from this German pseudoscientist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. So it starts with the premise that race is a fact of nature. Race is just out there. It's part of the furniture of the universe, like stars, like flowers, right? Like any physical object that you can observe, any natural fact that you can observe out there in the world. Race is just like that. It's a fact of nature. Racial differences are rooted in this fact of nature, and they too are real. So race is a fundamental fact of nature. The fact that the races are different is a fundamental fact of nature. And then these differences, the argument continues, trigger our natural evolved tendencies towards tribal affiliation and tribal warfare. So this is kind of a contemporary update of how this view works. So race is a natural fact. Racial differences flow from that natural fact. And the fact that those differences exist triggers another natural fact about us, namely that we tend to affiliate with people who are like us and to dislike outgroups, right? People who are not like us. Therefore, racism is a natural evil. So no one is to blame for racism. Racism isn't really a product of human intention in any sense. Racism just is a natural consequence of our biological nature. So if you want the sort of more updated version of it, sort of the way contemporary evolutionary psychologists sometimes talk about it, race is a natural fact. It leads to real differences between populations. Our early evolutionary environment of adaptation was one in which we lived in tribes and there was constant tribal warfare. So we had really strong, powerful affiliations of members of our own tribe, and we tended to be ready to fight and to engage in warfare with members of other tribes. And so race becomes, on this story, a kind of natural trigger of these tribal tendencies. Coates, writing about this idea, says, in this way, racism is rendered as the innocent daughter of Mother Nature. And what Baldwin does is he flips this analysis. He says, race is not a biological, but rather a social political concept. As Baldwin writes, no one was white before he or she came to America. It took generations and a vast amount of coercion before this became a white country. So America became white because of the necessity of justifying Black subjugation. So the idea here is that the traditional view gets things backwards. Race is not a fact of nature, according to Baldwin's analysis. Rather, there was a need for cheap labor. Therefore, an ideology was generated that justified the use of some people as mere instruments or as slaves. And so race is not a biological fact, rather it's a social political one. And so here's a passage from On Being White and Other Lies where he talks about this idea. He says, and they have brought humanity to the edge of oblivion because they think they are white. Because they think they are white, they do not dare confront the ravage and the lie of their history. Because they think they are white, they cannot allow themselves to be tormented by the suspicion that all men are brothers. Because they think they are white, they are looking for or bombing into existence stable populations, cheerful natives, and cheap labor. Because they think they are white, they believe, as even no child believes, in the dream of safety. This is very important, this language where Baldwin talks about people who believe they are white. What that implies is that there are, in fact, no white people. The notion that white people exist is an invention, and it was invented so that certain people could carry out the subjugation of other people. In a nutshell, if you look closely at different groups of people, you'll find that there are no defining characteristics that they all share in common, in virtue of which you can clump them into different races. Rather, what happened is that a certain group of people who held power in the world claimed a kind of tribal affiliation with each other, and then used that claim of a fundamental affiliation and of the supremacy of their particular group to subjugate other groups and declare them members of a unique racial group. So it's a really profound move, a profound and innovative conceptual move. And Baldwin writes in this essay towards the end, he says, in this debasement and definition of Black people, they debased and defamed themselves. Well, how did they debase and defame themselves? Well, they did all kinds of horrible things in the name of their own supremacy, namely slavery, right, which was a systematic torture and brutalization of a vast number of people. So they debased themselves just as they debased the people that they subjugated. What I want to point out here is the kind of freedom to invent and experiment that the essay gives you. So if Baldwin had been writing in a different genre, say he was writing in a philosophical academic form of writing in the 1980s, he would have had to engage with all of these different views, which were attempting to identify a kind of genetic basis of a notion of race. And instead of having to engage with that, what he does is very powerfully simply motivates his own position. This idea that really, at the end of the day, when you look at race, it looks like a social political concept and not like a genuinely biological one. And he doesn't have to engage in all of the kind of academic warfare where you take on all comers and try to show that their views are incorrect. Rather, what he does is very beautifully and eloquently and in a rhetorically powerful way conveys this unique position. So it's a conceptual innovation, one that he was free to engage in because he was writing in this genre of the essay.